Hello and welcome to the Banker's monthly preview to discuss the cover feature for the September issue of the magazine. This month is our G-SIB special issue, which includes extra content relating to some of the topics that will be under discussion during Swift's user conference, which is being held virtually for the first time ever between the 5th and 8th of October. Also for the first time ever, it's free to attend, so sign up if you haven't already. Our cover story this month is all around the stability and robustness of the global systemically important banks, or G-SIBs, specifically those from Europe and North America. I'm Joy Macknight, Managing Editor of The Banker, and I'm joined by Investment Banking and Capital Markets Editor Marie Kemplay, who wrote the cover story this month. Marie, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Joy. Good to speak to you about this.
Okay, so clearly it's been a challenging time for banks on both sides of the Atlantic, which appear to be faring better. Is it the European or the North American G-SIBs during the second quarter of 2020?
Well, that's a good question, Joy, but it isn't a straightforward geographical story we found when we've done our analysis. So what we did was we have taken financial data from the 23 G-SIBs that are based in North America and Europe, and we've run them through our best performing banks model, which looks at 8 different metrics such as profitability, asset quality, and liquidity to come up with an overall measure for how well a sample of banks are performing. And in this group of G-SIBs that we analysed, we found that the 2 top best performing banks were Morgan Stanley and State Street, which are both US banks, obviously. But out of the top 10 best performing G-SIBs, actually 6 of them are European banks. And that's pretty interesting because I think it's fair to say for the last few years, there's really been quite a strong narrative around the fact that North American banks, particularly those in the US, are generally seen to be in better shape than their European peers. But US banks have been hit pretty hard this year by credit provisions, which I guess kind of accounts for what's going on at the moment.
Okay, and it sounds like asset quality is a significant theme in these results. Is that true?
Yes, exactly. So I mentioned already that Morgan Stanley and State Street came at the top of our table, and both of those banks have relatively small loan books compared to their peers. So during the current economic difficulties that we've been experiencing kind of globally, it's been in their favor because these 2 banks have not actually had to set aside as much in provisions for souring loans as their peers. And another interesting point is for US banks, this period of economic disruption has actually coincided with the introduction of a new accounting standard, which is known as CECL. And that probably sounds like a pretty arcane and technical point, but it's actually a really important detail here because US banks are now required to set aside provisions for impaired loans earlier on in the life cycle of a loan than they were under the previous regime. And what that what one analyst told us he felt that meant was that it had led to credit provisions for US banks perhaps increasing by 25 to 30% when compared to the previous regime.
Okay.
Yeah, whereas European banks obviously are operating under a different accounting regime. And another interesting point is that a lot of some analysts have noted that there seems to be a bit of a lack of consistency in how European banks are approaching the issue of provisions and calculating those. So, maybe some are being too optimistic, maybe some are being too conservative. It's kind of hard to get underneath that. So, in short, I guess what I'm really saying is the picture of who is faring the best is a kind of a bit of a question mark, really, and we'll have to wait until the end of the year to really see what the true economic impact of the pandemic has been and how that will really affect the banks.
Okay, but maybe you could say sort of which banks have performed the best on profitability.
Yeah, so this is another. So within our best performing model, profitability is one of the key metrics that we look at, and this is another area where Morgan Stanley has topped the table, and then it was followed thereafter by Credit Suisse and UBS. And interestingly, this is another area where North American banks seem to kind of punch below their weight in our rankings. Just 3 out of the top 10 G-SIBs for profitability were North American banks in our analysis. But, banks across the board have taken quite a hit on profits already. So pre-tax profits at both North American and European G-SIBs fell significantly in the first 6 months of 2020 compared to the first 6 months of 2019. So by around 52% for European G-SIBs and around 58% for North American G-SIBs. So, everybody has kind of taken a bit of a hit, really.
Thanks so much for your insights, Marie. It sounds like a very interesting article. Our readership can access it at thebanker.com.